Okay, I'm going to get started. It's 1:03. Obviously, people will continue to come in. My name is Neil Seldman. I work for Zero Waste USA, and this is a composting webinar put on by COOLNow, a program of Zero Waste USA. Rick Anthony is the project manager. Chris Sparnicht is our technical person who's been helping out. And today, in our series of composting, we have two really remarkable people who have moved the composting sector forward for the last several years. Nora Goldstein from BioCycle is a second generation composter and educator, and who is the editor and publisher of BioCycle. And Craig Coker from Coker Composting in Virginia has been a lead consultant for cities, counties, industry, and thanks to him for working with me on community projects. Both Nora and Craig work together, and they are quite a tandem and just an encyclopedia of information on our composting movement. I just want to take 1 minute to give a little bit of history here. As I've been writing the last few months in Resource Recovery magazine, I described the early recycling movement of bottles and cans and paper starting in the late 1960s. It started with spontaneous citizen groups starting drop-off centers throughout the 1970s. Those drop-off centers became small business and community collection programs. And by 1980, recycling had taken over the hearts and minds of the American people, and cities and counties started taking over and implementing their own programs. I think this is important because I think the last few years we're seeing the exact same type of development in composting. Citizens groups, compost gardens started composting. They've been activists in getting their communities and cities and counties to start composting. And it is a glorious movement of small scale growing and scaling up. And with that bit of history, I would say that as composting is going to continue, we can see perhaps finally reaching very high rates of diversion through recycling and composting in the country. We're now at 30%. I will optimistically predict that within 10 years, we can double that rate as composting becomes state of the art throughout the country. With that, Craig and Nora have put together quite a program for us. I will now keep quiet and introduce Nora, who will kick off the discussion. It will last about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have close to an hour for discussion and question and answer. Again, Nora, thank you for joining us. Please get us started.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having Craig and I here. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. I spotted some names of people entering the waiting room, and some very close, dear, longtime friends are part of the audience today. Next slide. We're here to talk about the state of organics management, but first a little background. As Neil mentioned, I'm a second generation BioCycle person. I started right out of college, and it's the only job I've ever had. We are in addition to all the how-to articles, many contributed, thankfully, by Craig over the years. We cover the full gamut of organics recycling. We do surveys, and I've gotten into more and more contract work on specific projects over the years. And I'll just let Craig talk about his background a bit. And his camera isn't working, so Craig, you go ahead.
Thank you, Nora, and I apologize for the technical difficulty. Again, I'm Craig Coker with Coker Composting and Consulting. I've been in the composting industry since 1977, had my own consulting firm since 2005, and have had the privilege of working on about 250 projects over the last 19 years. I've worked with Nora now for 17 years, and she's been kind enough to publish 80 of my articles. I'm also a co-owner of a small composting company here in Roanoke, Virginia, and was the former owner of Mountain Organic Materials in Asheville.
Great. Well, now you know who we are, so we're going to dive right in. And, you know, if you had asked me what the problem was 30 years ago, I'm not so sure that this would have been the methane crisis, landfill-related methane crisis wouldn't have been on the top of our list. But for many decades, getting organics out of the landfill has been a main focus of our work. And it was just, you know, we've known for years, and there's been articles for years, that food waste, when disposed in the landfill, breaks down and emits methane before that landfill gas capture system ever takes effect. And finally, last October, EPA released a report on quantifying methane emissions from landfill food waste and put a number to what we've been suspecting and have had some data to show, that food waste is actually 58% of fugitive methane emissions. And that's so significant. And it's a number, you know, to be able to point to this. Sally Brown, who's a columnist for Biocycle and a soil scientist with the University of Washington, looked at that data and actually wrote a column with some revised numbers using more current landfill methane emission numbers. So this is even low based on that. Next slide, please. I think, you know, its methane emissions have been continually rising. Landfill methane emissions are a significant contributor to all greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And one thing that has happened very recently is an organization called Carbon Mapper, working with Industrious Labs and Rocky Mountain Institute, has been tracking fugitive methane emissions from landfills, and it's really significant. So it's not only if the landfill is not capped and emitting, you know, the food waste related emissions, but even capped, there's significant leakage. So this is a big focus. Go ahead.
In addition to the methane problem, recent research by the University of Florida has found that landfill gas can serve as a major pathway for the mobility of PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, from MSW landfills. The discarded PFAS-laden consumer products, including textiles, wood products, packaging, and commonly landfilled industrial byproducts like MSW incinerator ash, wastewater biosolid, are known contributors to PFAS loading in landfills. Dr. Townsend's research at UFL suggests that the toxicity of volatile PFAS species, as opposed to those that are not volatile, and again, volatile means ability to convert to a gaseous emission. Dr. Townsend's work shows that the volatile PFAS species, particularly a group called fluorotellular alcohols, are significantly higher than the non-volatile counterparts and are contributing potential health impacts via the inhalation pathway. And one might say, well, I can't smell landfill gas, but we've all heard stories of landfills that have odors and odors that get off site, and an odor is nothing more than an emitted gas.
So I think, you know, given, you know, compostable organics out of the landfill is who, you know, organized this webinar, and I think we've made the case for how important that is. But what is our challenge in the land of organics recycling, and more specifically composting? And BioCycle conducted several surveys last year, one on residential food waste collection access. And very quickly, what we mean by access is it's the number of jurisdictions that provide access to food scraps collection. It is not the number that are actively participating necessarily. And so we identified 400 programs serving about 15 million people. Those 400 programs encompass 700 communities. And within those 400, 230 are curbside collection only, 139 are drop-off stations only, and 31 are a combination of curbside and drop-off. And the one thing I want to point out is we were collecting data just as jurisdictions were coming on board in California, which many of you know requires that the jurisdictions offer residential food scrap collection. And so we got down to counting all but any municipalities under 40,000 in population. We just ran out of time. So the number of 15 million is on the low side, it's conservative. Next slide, please. So not only does the vast majority of the country not have access to collection of food scraps, but the reality is that when it comes to what BioCycle defines as full-scale food waste composting infrastructure, meaning facilities open year-round, capable of receiving material from loader trucks and other trucks, and processing at least a minimum of 2,000 tons a year of source-separated organics, we're still on the low side. So we counted 201 facilities that met that definition in the US. And what that isn't counted, although a lot of the larger scale, what are known as community composters, decentralized composting operations, we have a number of those in this data. There's still a vast majority more who are providing decentralized infrastructure. And so it's important when you look at this map that it's undercounting the capacity that those kinds of operations bring to the whole picture. Next, please. So one of the projects Craig and I worked on together for Closed Loop Partners Composting Consortium was to look at the, by far in a way, the greatest number of composting facilities in the US process yard trimmings. But of those, that great number of 33,500, whatever the number is, a significant number don't operate year round. They receive leaves in the fall and garden debris and grass clippings in the summer, and otherwise they're not staffed full time. But we took a look at what if we could tap into the existing yard trimmings composting infrastructure to start accepting source separated food scraps. And we did a ranking of all 50 states based on 5 factors: ease of permitting, presence of permitting tiers, the cost to upgrade, the time required to go through the permitting and upgrade, and if the state has a food waste disposal ban. And if you look, the least favorable for states for converting yard trimmings infrastructure to taking food scraps starts with the bright red and scales to orange and then yellow, and the boldest green is the most favorable. And you'll see there's one state that has bold green, and that's New York State. And for a lot of reasons, which I'd be happy to respond, and Craig and I could respond to in the Q&A, they are the model in the way we did the evaluation. Next slide, please.
So how can we address this problem? I think the answer is we have to start looking at organics recycling systems. And a system consists of source separated organics, which is called SSO, consists of diversionary strategies. How do we get the stuff out of the waste stream to begin with? Collection mechanisms, processing technologies, and recovered organics product usage programs. Systemic thinking and practice at multiple levels, from personal to local government, national government, international government, is key in identifying and overcoming barriers to sustainability in organics recycling systems. And we're going to take a look at each of these components of systemic thinking.
So one of the first places, or the first place to start when you're looking at source separated organics is reduction. You know, how, and the primary focus there is on food waste, both agricultural, commercial, and residential. And there's been a number of initiatives over the last 15 plus years on looking at how we can really encourage waste, you know, food waste prevention and then source reduction. And part of that is doing these campaigns to raise household residential consumer awareness. And the Solid Waste Authority of Central Ohio initiated a Save More Than Food campaign a few years back, and they got funding, I think it was EPA and some other funding, to actually track a certain number of households in the town of Upper Arlington, Ohio, to see how the Save More Than Food campaign intervention would play out over a course of a year. And so they started by doing a baseline characterization study of those households' waste stream, determined how much food waste was in it, and then just consistently educated around the campaign for about a year. And what they found is they got a 23% reduction in food waste, which could be attributed to the education, being aware of what you're wasting, better, smarter shopping, et cetera, and a 30% overall decrease in landfill food waste. So there's a peer-reviewed paper about that research that you might want to look into. Another example is the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and they did a ton of research of household focus groups and other to really, in surveying, to determine what is it that, how do you get people's attention? How do you change behavior? And they launched the Don't Let Good Food Go Bad campaign. And what they found is that 85% of Oregon households agreed they could do more to reduce food spoilage. But what they also learned in that was that telling people that by reducing the amount of food they waste is actually really a beneficial thing to do for the climate, reducing those landfill methane emissions. But what really motivated, and that they could save money, and ultimately the campaign they launched was much more about saving money. That got people's attention much more than thinking they're doing something good for the climate. Next, please. Another diversionary strategy, this is newer, and it's essentially use of in-home, in-kitchen food scrap dehydrator systems. There's a handful of companies that have these units in the marketplace, different ways they're being marketed and packaged. But essentially, if you take the water out of the food scraps and also put it through some pathogen treatment, you get a very shelf stable material. So in theory, that could be a benefit to frequency of curbside collection, other alternatives. This material can be used in your garden. It can be added to your backyard compost bin. It can be added to a centralized or decentralized composting facility. But the most important thing when these products launched was some of the companies really equated this output and the machine to compost, and full stop. You cannot make compost in this kind of machine, nor in a 24-hour unit that says you can make compost. It's not physically and biologically and chemically possible. But I think this is the kind of technology intervention and innovation that is important to take into account when you start to look at your programs. One of the things that we found is that it makes in the kitchen, separating your food scraps a more pleasant experience. If you're not storing them on the, on the countertop, you're getting rid of the ick factor. So those are just some of the benefits that we wanted to bring to your attention. Next, please.
Nora and I recently had the pleasure of working with Brenda Platt from ILSR on a feasibility study for the town of Cary, North Carolina. And Brenda had some really good suggestions for how the town could beef up its backyard bin composting program. So one thing to do is make bins available year-round. Consider establishing a rebate program for households that build their own home composting system. Consider using trained staff or master composters to assist the elderly and or the disabled with backyard composting operations. Develop methods to track backyard composting bin use. Understand the potential for diversion via home composting by incentivizing home composters to weigh the amount of material they are composting at home and to share that data with the local jurisdiction. And consider a leaf or carbon bank, such as you see in the picture here in the city of Tacoma Park, which is a site where residents can drive up and pick up fall leaves or wood chips 24/7 year-round. In addition, communities need to enhance their community composting operations with pest-resistant designs. In this illustration, this is a forced aeration micro bin similar to the one provided by O2 Compost, with a smart bin for receiving food scraps from members or subscribers, an expandable carbon storage bin, and a concrete slab. Clearly, that raises the cost of community composting, but making them pest resistant is an important component of growing that program. In 2022, ILSR conducted a national census of community composters that indicated community composting operations are on the rise in the US, and they can result in a myriad of co-benefits, including community engagement, youth education, and local use of compost. Good collection system design and operation is the second building block in the organics recycling system thinking. Curbside collection programs can be SSO only or co-collection with yard trimmings. They can be voluntary sign-up, what's called a standard offering, which means it's available to everybody in a community, or they can be mandatory. Key considerations in curbside programs are understanding the difference between participation rates and set out rates. Just because a household signs up doesn't mean that they're going to actually set the cart out every week. Now, due to safety concerns in the solid waste industry, many about traditional rear-loading trash truck, more solid waste haulers are switching to automated side loaders. These are known as ASLs. These save money by only needing a driver rather than a 2-man or 3-man crew on a rear loader. But it's not possible for the driver to monitor the contents of the collected SSO container for contamination, or for programs to co-collect food waste and yard trim, whether the yard trim cart has any food waste in it. Now, the weights of the collected SSO can be monitored with load cells on the lifting arm. The lifting arms have about an 8-second cycle time between when they pick the cart up and when they set it back down. And it is theoretically possible, although I haven't found anybody doing it yet, to use cameras to video the cart contents as it's being unloaded into the ASL. What you see in the photograph is a new version of ASL meant for organics. It's a 14 cubic yard ASL made by New Way under the brand name Rotopack. So
another part of this whole systems thinking is, how do you change the system? And most specifically for this slide and the next slide is, how do you change behavior? And so you're introducing a new program its success depends on the participation of the those who are going to be receiving the service. And so this particular what they call the early adoption curve, or the Rogers diffusion model, and I just did with this different project that Craig's involved in. We did these case studies, a deep dive into 6 municipal programs, and they had varying levels of approach to how they were. I'm sorry, they were all residential food scrap collection, and different approaches, some curbside, some drop off, some both. And what became clear is, the participation rate. Most of these, or all of these programs, had the involvement of the innovators, the enthusiasts in the community who will do anything just about to do what they can to help the environment, to address climate. And then you have the early adopters. So they're willing, they're not as necessarily have the same degree of enthusiasm, but they're very willing to participate and also tolerate some inconveniences. And so we found through both last year's survey and the deep dives that on the case studies, that most programs can hit that 5 to 20% mark. Many of them are at 20. One program in particular is at 53% or so, over 50%. And that's the chunk I just wanted to spend a minute on, because what we're finding is and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right at the end of the early adopters and into the early majority, that's where we really need to focus with existing programs. And then also as you think about program design, because the people who are the early majority, they're willing, it's not like they're tuning you out. This just has to be really convenient. The glitches have to be worked out. And what are some other things here? I'm just looking at minimal learning and minimum cost to no cost. And so that's that's where the challenge lies now, into how to bring those people into the fold. And again, Craig and I can give some examples in the Q&A. If you could go to the next slide, Craig, because this further illustrates. So when you're looking at how do you do that, how do you get to that 50%, outreach and education, and what I'd like to call the investment in engagement, is so critical and has to be baked into the programs before they ever start. The line budget item, so you have funding for continuous engagement. And that engagement does not have to be just sending more flyers. I mean, that's a first out of the starting gate. If you're distributing carts or kitchen caddies, that's an opportunity to educate and build awareness, and videos, all those sorts of things, on tier 1. Tier 2 and tier 3 are really where you really have to emphasize the in-person, the personalized engagement, the door knocking, the cart tagging, to even do some peer-to-peer, like getting a neighborhood group that's involved, very active as within their neighborhood, getting them involved in being your champions, and doing a little, not, I'd hate to say the shame game, but there's, a little bit of that, like, why aren't you doing that yet? But the point of this slide is, in your program design, you really have to bake this in, because even if you have a policy like the state of California or some other places where it's mandatory to participate, the policy will only get you so far. That creates the playing field. Next slide. So a couple of things that we've seen, and Neil is very familiar with the pay-as-you-throw. He, along with Brenda Platt, I think have been the big champions, which is obviously, downsizing your trash cart to and taking advantage of cost savings or no cost to participate in recycling and organics recycling. The other thing I just want to be sure to mention in the lower right corner is a shot of a what used to be a micro hauler. Now I call them an organic niche company because they're beyond micro in terms of the territory they service, the kind of vehicles. But there's got to be a carve out in franchise hauler agreements for micro haulers, for use of innovative technologies. We're finding that in a lot of cases, the one company gets trash, recycling, and organics, and organics may not be what some are very experienced in yard trimmings, but much less experienced in what has to happen around increasing participation with regard to adding food scraps. And so making sure your franchise agreements start to have this carve out, plus the monetary incentives on pay as you throw, should really help to build participation and make it worthwhile for those trucks to run up and down, the streets, because they're pulling more food scraps out of the neighborhood. Next slide. And the one example of using this pay-as-you-throw model is the city of Vancouver, Washington, which about 4 years ago, I get my different programs, different years, but it's been going for a few years, where they essentially upgraded their organics collection from just yard trimmings to include food scraps. And so the franchise hauler, there's 47,600-ish households who are eligible for city service for curbside, and they use a pay-as-you-throw model. And so you can see you get options of every other week collection, weekly collection. And so you can see that if you have a cart that is trash cart that's at 25, maybe you can add in the organics cart and downsize the trash cart, because the cost for the organics cart is much less. So this is options and scenarios we're seeing being put into effect by various jurisdictions. Next.
Another problem we have is the lack of mainstream discussion of greenhouse gas emissions. When my partners and I started Star City Compost in 2023, we started with a marketing message about how much solid waste our local solid waste authority was landfilling and how much of that was food waste. Turned out that every year this authority landfills 69,000 tons of food waste. And we were trying to sell the food waste collection service we offer on the basis that if we can recycle 1% of that 69,000 tons, we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to the amount of electricity used by 5,885 homes here in the Roanoke Valley. And that message fell flat, in part because it's not part of our mainstream societal dialogue, and in part because Roanoke Valley is in the western side of Virginia, very rural and very conservative. So one solution is to make sure that local climate action plans include provisions for reducing food waste. Another is to push for more aggressive monitoring of landfill fugitive emissions, because you can't manage what you don't measure. That's a rule of thumb that has been proven true a million times. Another option would be use compost as alternative daily cover. And I know some of the audience is frowning about that concept, but remember that it's not only a method of mitigating gaseous emissions from compost piles, it's a method of mitigating gaseous emissions from landfill cells. Now, the other collection mechanism that's important to consider is drop-off. Drop-off stations for SSO are gaining in popularity. For public programs, siting can be done in concert with other public facilities. For example, in Boston, the Jamaica Plains Library has a food waste drop-off station. In the town of Cary, North Carolina, they just opened one in Mills Run Park. For private programs, we have found with Star City Compost, we need to get the landowners to request local approvals for the drop-offs. Otherwise, we get into some zoning issues. But we have had some really good success here in the Roanoke Valley, citing our drop-off stations at houses of worship, where the congregants to the house of worship sign up to pay our $10 a month user fee for access to the drop-off box. In either case, public or private, use the concept of drive time analysis to locate possible sites. This map was put together by our colleagues at GT Environmental. It's an ArcGIS base map with a 10-minute drive time polygon layer on 2 existing food waste drop-off stations and 2 more that we've helped locate. The theory being that most people would probably not mind driving 10 minutes to drop their food waste off at a drop-off station. So drop-off stations are an important part of this whole collection systemic thinking. The third building block, of course, in the systems thinking concept is the processing of the source-separated organics. And there are many in the organics recycling space that think that anaerobic digestion and composting are competing technologies, but consider that AD, or anaerobic digestion, is just a means of converting organic carbon to methane in order to capture the energy value of the SSO. So in reality, they are quite compatible. And many of the anaerobic digestion facilities in Europe are coupled with composting facilities. There are some here in the US that are coupled together as well. Now, like any product made from recovered organics, you're going to need a market for the biogas, either electricity or what's called renewable natural gas, or RNG. And you will have to have a plan for managing the digestate. Digestates have a higher nutrient content because anaerobic digestion is a concentrated type of technology. And total nitrogen values of more than 7% are not unusual in digestates. Now, if digestates come out of a low solids anaerobic digester, the traditional liquid style of AD facility, they're normally land applied to cropland. But increasingly, we're seeing that water quality sensitive watersheds that require crop management through nutrient management plans can make land application far more limited and far more challenging. Now, high solids AD, either a horizontal plug flow reactor or dry fermentation, will produce a high solids digestate, although albeit with reduced volatile solids because the volatile solids are consumed by the AD reaction. So if you manage the digestate by composting, you will require some sort of fresh material like yard trimmings to restore the volatile solids lost to the AD reaction. And another alternative with high solids digestates is to dewater and dry the digestate. The picture on the right is the blue dried biosolids digestate from DC Water at the Blue Plains Treatment Plant in Washington, DC. So for SSO diversion programs where SSO is collected separately from yard trim, a low solids AD system may be the most proven and cost-effective option. These are usually called combined stirred tank reactors. This is a traditional liquid digestion system. The SSO, though, will need to be depackaged and slurried prior to pumping it into the reactor. As you see in the upper picture, the Exeter main anaerobic digester, and the loader operator is about to feed that into a depackaging machine. And the digestate will come out as a liquid with about 1.5 to 3% total solids. So if you can't land apply that directly to cropland, it will need to be dewatered. Now, the dewatered solids can be composted or they can be dried. The effluent from dewatering can be land applied, can be sent to a wastewater treatment plant in some cases, or in other cases can be sold as a liquid fertilizer. But it's very important to remember that digestate management is going to be a cost for the most part. Now, where you have a diversion program where SSO is co-collected with yard trim, then dry fermentation AD, as you see in the graphic on the lower part of the slide, followed by composting, is likely a very feasible solution. Biogas yields from dry fermentation are a little bit lower than with your combined stirred tank reactor AD system because yard trimmings don't make a lot of biogas. But the digestate is handled as a solid waste, so you don't have that dewatering and effluent management consideration. Aerated static pile composting is becoming the preferred way of composting source-separated organics. Forced aeration will keep the compost pile aerobic more easily than windrows, and that higher oxygen content provides more efficient composting. Now, aeration can be positive, negative, or both. Positive means you're blowing your air into the pile. Negative means you're pulling it down through the pile. Positive aeration will benefit from an 8-inch to 10-inch layer of unscreened compost or a breathable fabric cover over the pile for odor management. Negative aeration needs some form of managing the condensate because that hot, saturated air will immediately condense when it hits the outside air. So you either need a sewer connection or some very positive way of handling that condensate. And you will also need a separate biofilter for odor management. Now, reciprocating systems would alternate between positive and negative, have a benefit in producing a more consistent temperature profile in your compost pile, but you need both pile covers and a separate biofilter. Your aeration rate should be set around 5 cubic feet per minute per cubic yard of material in the pile during that period of maximum oxygen demand from decomposition of the organics, which is roughly days 5 through 12. It should be lower than that in the first few days to allow the pile pH to rise and allow the thermophilic bacteria to begin to dominate the compost pile. And aeration rates can be lowered after you finish decomposing the bulk of the material in the pile. Your aeration rates can be modified with simple timers, or you can use more sophisticated thermocouple and variable frequency drive systems. A VFD modifies the voltage going to the blower motor, which either speeds it up or slows it down and changes the airflow rate. And now aeration delivery piping, we are still seeing perforated PVC laid in the trench. We're also now seeing Sparnicht systems installed below the slab.
So the technologies, the options you have for processing the organics, one of the things that comes up fairly frequently as a challenge is if you launch a program, how can you ensure that it's scalable? How do you know you're going to have enough material flowing to a facility that you've invested in? And if you're taking residential organics as, you know, in your design and counting that, part of that gets to the participation rate challenges we were showing in the adoption curve. But the first step is you start with a waste characterization study to get your baseline. And it's so important to have a baseline. If you can do multiple, do some individual households, do what comes into the transfer station, some individual businesses, if you're taking commercial and institutional, the numbers tend to be, when at the end of the day, the percent of food scraps in the trash stream tends to always fall in that range. And Craig, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 20 to 30%, is a ballpark of food scraps. But what you don't know is how much of that you're going to get. And so what modeling is done, and Craig has done this on a couple projects along with GT Environmental, is running projections around a 5% participation, a 20%, a 60%. And composting facilities can be fairly amenable to scaling depending on your footprint, but you can, if you have room for another aerated pile or another windrow. And what we're seeing, what's interesting is some of the more built facilities will build for a phase 1, phase 2, but put all the necessary hardware in place for phase 2 while they're constructing the site from the beginning. So they're not necessarily using that portion, but it's there and ready to go as things scale. Anaerobic digestion, on the other hand, can be very challenging to scale, especially, the tank systems you put in, all the piping and biogas handling and all that. But sometimes the more modular systems like Craig was showing in the earlier slide, the dry fermentation, there might be room for that. But as it says here, the last bullet, with windrow and aerated static pile, it can be more simple to expand, more challenging if you're doing in-vessel composting. And Craig, I think you're on next.
So problem number 2 is NIMBYism, which we all know means not in my backyard. And then there's also the caves, the citizens against virtually everything. This is now an ingrained part of American life, and it's made far more challenging for organics processing infrastructure development by the vast amount of misinformation and disinformation from multiple sources. I've had several clients spend tens of thousands of dollars to do the upfront planning and thinking about an organics processing facility, only to be denied local government approvals due to citizen pressures. And once the citizens have turned against you, it is almost impossible to change their minds about your planned processing facility at that particular site. So, as I said, this comes up most often in the site selection phase of organics processing facility development. 2 solutions are including finding a large enough site with adequate vegetative screening that's close to waste and product markets, but that's costly. Another solution is a public-private partnership where the public body leases to a private party municipally owned land already in use for waste management, such as around a closed landfill, a wastewater treatment plant, or a transfer station. Developing a composting or organics processing facility can incur upfront costs of multiple thousands of dollars. You have to plan the facility, find a site, get all your permits and approvals, design it, build it, hire your staff, start operations before your tip fee or compost product revenue is going to start flowing. We built Star City Compost, a 1,700 ton per year facility over a 2-year period with about 2,000 hours of donated labor, donated equipment, $85,000 in equity investments, and $25,000 in loans from friends and family. Now, the investing community is interested in private sector composting, but they are frustrated at the lack of industry-wide statistics about financial performance. Being able to show outside investors tight financial controls and good business acumen is critical in order to get them to make the investment. On the positive side, we are starting to see some good influx of federal and state grant dollars into organics recycling, and this is encouraging. Some state grant programs like North Carolina and Colorado can grant monies directly to the private sector. When I was the North Carolina Organics Recycling Coordinator in the 1990s, one of my grants was to a private composter to build a truck for collecting food scraps from restaurants in the Triangle region of North Carolina. We need some innovative means of raising the needed capital for infrastructure development. If you look at the water and wastewater treatment industries, they've been using the concept of revolving loan funds for years. And the way a revolving loan fund works is needs for money on a priority list. Highest ranked projects get funded first, with those loans repaid by water and sewer fees. It's not hard to envision a similar structure for organic recycling. The fourth building block of the organics recycling systemic thinking is product usage programs. These are the different products that can be made from recycled SSO. Primary product is going to be biogas, and that can either be combusted to make electricity or cleaned up to become renewable natural gas. The utility companies are not that interested in distributed electrical generation. Recent trend has been toward producing RNG. And some are interested in vehicle fuel from RNG, but it looks like there are cheaper ways to make that hydrogen fuel, mostly from the electrolysis of water. As we've discussed before, digestate from AD systems can be land applied to crops, or it can be turned into a product. High quality compost is needed to get the best price point, but there may be future water quality compost as landfill alternative cover or disturbed land reclamation soil amendment. Soil blends made with compost are an important tool in the toolbox to broaden the markets and to dampen the seasonal variability of pure compost sales. And some producers have found markets for compost-enhanced mulches made from regrinding the overs coming off post screen. There are requirements to ensure the success of usage programs. The most important of a sound, well thought out marketing and sales plan. You should not assume that if you make a product, people will flock to you to buy it. Plan that addresses concepts like competing products within about 50 miles of your facility, marketing goals and objectives, market communications mechanisms, which include concepts like branding and how to use social media. What are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for your products? And effective resource allocation and monitoring. In some communities, we believe there's a benefit from policies that develop a, quote, structural demand, end quote, for compost and compost-based soils. These policies can include a required minimum soil organic matter content for new development, and for redevelopment, a requirement to rebuild the soil profile. These soil health policies have a secondary benefit in similar management of rainfall over stormwater runoff. And that concludes our remarks, and I'll turn it over to Guy in the question and answer period.
Nora and Craig, thank you so much. It was a pleasure watching what I will call a tour de force of the industry at this present time. So we're deeply grateful, and I'm sure your PowerPoints are going to be requested by many people on the call. Having said that, let's get right to the questions. Chris and Rick, did you want to pick out some of the key questions you saw in the chat?
I have a few questions here that I can bring up.
Please do.
The first question is from Lucy Bay. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What % of people would drive to drop-off sites within 10 miles of their home, and how often would they go?
I don't have an answer to that particular question, and it's not 10 miles. It was 10 minutes in the analysis we did for the town of Cary, North Carolina. It could be that people aren't willing to drive more than 5 minutes. People look for convenience. That's one thing that makes curbside programs more attractive to many people than drop-off programs. But you need both. You need
I
the complete
apologize. She
fabric.
did say 10 minutes, not 10 miles.
Okay.
Right.
I don't have any hard data on that. I'm sorry. That
Yeah,
was an assumption we used in the study.
Yeah, I would just add that in the case studies we just recently completed, if drop-off sites are in, let's just say they're at the transfer station or the recycling depot where people go, maybe not on their way to run errands or pick up the children at school or go to work. So a couple of the programs are experimenting with more drop-offs in towns that are on people's routes, and in one case they're using kind of like those smart bins that New York City has for organics drop-off. So I think the convenience factor is there, and then accommodating it. The other thing I'd say in terms of urban footprints for density, and I noticed somebody from the city of Minneapolis on attending here, but my takeaway in Minneapolis is, especially if you're servicing a lot of multifamily buildings and getting that participation, there's really only so far people will walk unless it's on their way to the light rail or the metro. And a lot of creativity. Craig or somebody mentioned, oh yeah, in Boston, like at the public library drop-offs, New York City does that. So I think, it's convenience is always going to be a factor when it comes to drop-off. But there's a definite willingness and hunger, enthusiasts and early adopters. And eager beavers, I saw somebody put in the chat, and I can't remember the other names.
I will add my sense on this. I live in Montclair, New Jersey, and within 3 minutes by car, there's a garden, and the gardeners welcome people dropping off compost in bins, and it's you get a nice thank you every time you drop off your organics. It's a community builder. Okay, next question, Chris.
Okay, the next question is from Gary Liss. We're working in a community in Massachusetts rolling out a citywide weekly food waste composting program to 20,000 households at no cost to residents. The city didn't want to adopt a mandatory ordinance, but have contracted to move to an every other week EOW trash service within 3 years. A key message to get to residents to sign up for food composting will be to get organics out of the trash, so EOW trash collection will work for them. Do you know of other communities that are leveraging the phase-in of EOW trash to motivate the early majority to sign up for food waste composting?
The city of Portland, Oregon, went to every other week trash collection. I think that is still the case. But that's an easy one to check. And I think successfully, I believe in Vancouver, you can also tap into every other week trash collection. Conceptually, it is I think an effective tool to build participation. I don't know what the pushback is from dealing with, I'll just give pet waste, diapers, things that are pre-tressable that can't go in your organics cart. So, but the tool it is effective, but I don't know a direct correlation statistically to increase participation in diverting the food scraps and yard trimmings.
Okay, if there is no other feedback on that, let's move to the next question. Ben Stanger has a question here. We had an idea to use a closed landfill from the 80s and it initially received positive feedback from the municipality. However, they eventually soured on the idea because they were worried about disturbing the cap. Any help with that sort of program? And he also says, if anyone has any info on renting space at a local recycling center, this is a possibility for us as well. Would love to speak to you about experience or any articles written on this.
In my experience, many state regulators are very opposed to the idea of reusing an MSW landfill for any other purpose that would risk disturbing the cap. So that generally means if you need to put up a building like a waste receipt building, maybe a hoop building on a concrete block foundation, or a pre-engineered metal building on a concrete slab, will be a no-go. I have seen windrow composting done on compacted gravel pads on top of old landfills. But generally, if you look at most old landfills, there's usually some perimeter area that's not part of the MSW fill area that may be suitable for modification into an organics processing facility.
Chris, I have a question, if you don't mind me jumping in, and that is on aerobic digestion. I know that the economy of scale is very broad. Cities have effectively built 5,000 ton per year systems for food coming from school cafeterias. And I also know that in Jessup, Maryland, a plant opened recently that is 120,000 tons per year capacity. Is there any industry information on how effective large scale versus small scale systems are in the AD industry?
Well, in terms of AD, I think the liquid systems, the conventional stirred tank reactors, somewhere on the order of 100,000 gallons in terms of capacity. Now, the dry fermentation systems, as Nora pointed out, are available because each of those is a separate reactor. Consider basically a self-storage unit that's 20 feet tall, wide, 80 feet deep. But you can bundle those together in several different configurations over time and as demand increased. But AD, for the most part, is not terribly scalable because you have so much investment in piping and valves and control systems and gas treatment and all that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there are a handful of companies in the US market that sell on-site AD systems, for, let's say, a food processing facility, a brewery, a restaurant, or I'm sorry, like a restaurant. Let's just say there's a few restaurants grouped together. So it's that is definitely a potential, but we have yet to see it really make significant breakthroughs. I think in large part, it's cost and then how you manage the liquid, the digestate.
And to that end, there is an Israeli company called Home Biogas that's been making AD systems for households for developing countries for many, many years. They are bringing a commercial unit to the American marketplace probably sometime this year for restaurants, convention centers, theme parks. And these would be smaller scaled AD systems where the biogas is combusted for hot water and used on site.
Thank you both. Chris, any further questions? Well, I'll ask another question if you don't mind. On contamination.
I'm sorry, Neil. I was.
Go ahead, Chris.
This one is from Rick Aho. Nora, how does reducing cost per ton as a focal point serve to influence the non-innovator population?
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat, and so it would be really reducing the cost per household, which in theory could be definitely affected by reducing the cost per ton for tipping the collected organics. There's definitely price points that I think households are willing to pay, especially a lot of the programs in the US are, they're opt-in, they're voluntary. And for example, Vancouver, you don't have to have an organics cart. You don't have to opt in. So if that's your choice, but then you need a bigger trash cart. In that example. So it's a great question, not a ton of research on it, in terms of where that price point is. And I don't know, Craig, have you looked into that at all? Factors related to, between this and this. And then one other thing I just wanted to mention is some programs, you're paying your annual, either it's your solid waste services are embedded in a general tax, your property tax, or an annual solid waste fee. So you're not necessarily seeing what it costs to, participate in the organics collection program. So that cost sensitivity typically comes up if it's a matter of subscribing to it, either through the franchised hauler or a private subscription service, or like a company like Mill with the dehydrator, where you can get a monthly service fee for having a unit in your house.
Chris, I just want to read a comment from our friend Dan Knapp from Urban Ore out in Berkeley. Dan wrote in the chat, old closed landfills have lots of space that often is turned into parks. Many are also fairly far from residences and businesses. How about parks that feature a percentage of surface use for on-site composting on re-engineered caps. Is that at all feasible, Nora and Craig?
In theory, I think the key issue is how do you avoid disturbing the cap? So if you have a 2-foot thick clay cap on a landfill as your final cap, and you can then add fill on top of that so that you're not going to be doing any excavation that threatens the integrity of the final cap, you may be able to convince regulators to let you do it. But you'll recall most landfills are mount trash bores, and that cap is going to be several hundred feet in the air in some cases. And you don't want to put an organics processing facility up on top of a hill.
Sure.
For the most part, because that's where the wind's going to pick up the odors and send them downhill.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks, Dan, for the comment. Chris, back to you.
Okay. Let's see here. From Allison Allen, does anyone have good siting criteria for identifying and building compost processing sites?
There may be something in a couple of back issues of Biocycle that Nora could refer you to. I did an article several years ago about siting facilities. But the basic rule of thumb is to be within 5 miles of a 4-lane arterial hot road, either a secondary or an interstate, have adequate sight so that you can have at least a 50-foot vegetated buffer on all 4 sides so that people can't see you because people smell with their eyes. Be reasonably flat so you don't have to spend a ton of money in earthwork. Lay out the site so that your trucks can come into the site without queuing back up on a public street, because that tends to just raise people's hackles rather badly. And consider the prevailing wind direction and what's downstream. Not only the prevailing wind direction, but also understand the patterns of community growth. Every community grows over 10, 20, 30 years in a particular direction. Now, like the very first project I worked on in the Washington metropolitan area, when we built that sludge composting facility, it was in the middle of nowhere. 30 years later, everything had developed all around it. And the Sanitation Commission was forced to shut it down because it was just the wrong land use at that time. There are other cases where development has overcome the ability of a composting facility to stay open. So understand, how is the community growing in geographic direction over time?
Yeah, and there's a question in the chat as well on zoning and how you can change local zoning laws to facilitate siting. And I know Craig's written a very good article in Biocycle about that. And it's free to search the Biocycle archives. Just go to biocycle.net, and they date back to 2004. And if you don't find it via one type of search, try another, and always feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help, as Craig is too. But yeah, I think zoning, is an immediate hurdle, especially the conditional uses. But Craig's way more articulate and conversant on that.
That is indeed a hurdle, because very few local zoning ordinances include the definition of an organics processing facility, composting facility, or anaerobic digestion facility in their defined land uses. You will always find definitions for asphalt plants and adult entertainment, but you will rarely find definition for a composting facility. So one strategy is to ask for a zoning text amendment and include that definition in the zoning ordinance. And as part of that, get that definition as an approved land use in some zones, like a manufacturing or industrial or agricultural zone, except that it will not be allowed in a residential zone. And for other kinds of zoning classifications, it may be subject to a conditional use permit. The problem with conditional use permits is that to get one involves two public hearings, usually one in front of the planning commission and one in front of the elected board of supervisors. And every time you have a public hearing about a composting facility, people will come out of the woodwork, fueled by a huge amount of misinformation and disinformation. So be prepared for a tough battle, and don't be alarmed if you smell boiling tar and see bags of feathers.
I have another question on a different topic on contamination. And this question comes from a conversation I had with executives from the DevCo plant, anaerobic digestion plant in Jessup, Maryland, which I mentioned earlier. And that plant has two sets of tipping fees. There's a tipping fee for commercial manufacturing organics and a higher tipping fee for source separated organics coming from households. And the reason for that is that the contamination from households is higher than you would get from a manufacturer. Is that an issue for the small composters that are using smaller scale composters that are using source separated organics from households?
Well, for example, with Star City Compost, we're selling our service to the innovators and early adopters on the diffusion curve. And so the biggest contamination problem we see is fruit stickers. And I've heard it said that fruit stickers are available in biodegradable wash-off form. So I'm looking forward to the day where that's widely in use. But your point is, it's a valid point that if you have to run a depackager, you have to run a piece of equipment, and that's going to cost you money to run that piece of equipment. And you need to recover those costs, usually in the form of a higher tip fee that for anything that has to go through a mechanical depackager or a pick line or any other kind of contaminant removal system.
Great.
Okay, do we need to go to another question?
Yes, please go ahead, Chris.
Great. I want to skip to Carol Jones. She asks, do you have a sense of how much food waste can be reduced through prevention, education, or diverted to distributed composting options, i.e. backyard, on-farm community, with best practice policies and programs? Refed indicates source reduction is much lower cost and much higher GHG reducing per ton than recycling, so I appreciate your identifying it as a top priority.
I think it boils down to how strong a cheerleader you have carrying the banner. If you have a community that has, like Minneapolis, has an extremely proactive program and is long been held as one of the best in the country. But you need somebody to really be the champion to advocate for waste reduction and getting materials diverted out of the waste stream.
Yeah, and what's interesting, which really is emerging, I'd say it's been emerging for a few years now, but in terms of like waste characterization studies, is sorting what, edible versus non-edible food and getting data on the percentage of of edible food, which is essentially a bite out of the whole apple, is still an edible food that, some way should be consumed, not ending up in the compost bin. Minneapolis does a sort for that. Seattle, Washington has started doing, sorts for edible and non-edible. And I think part of that outreach, that's one way then to increase the programming around wasted food reduction. I know in a conversation with Minneapolis, that's a huge priority. So I think we'll see more of that being baked in, generally speaking, and this goes back at least 10 plus years. EPA launched a campaign years ago, Love Food, Hate Waste, I think was theirs, or Food Too Good to Waste was EPA's. I remember NRDC did SaveTheFood.com, and the tips, everything is so logical. And there's even a refrigerator you can buy that I think is somehow designed to prioritize your edible food over your, freshly bought that still has time. So it gets back to that consumer behavior. One data point that Mill released data on their first year of bin, their food bin usage in households. It's a smart bin, so it takes weights on every ounce of food that's put in. And what they noticed was a 20% reduction in the amount of food being added to the bins over the course of the year. And then it kind of leveled off at that 20%. So it's the closest we have to in the home measurement of behavior. And they did a follow-up survey, and the respondents, I think it was 1 in 3 or 2, don't quote me, did say they reduced the amount. Once they saw how much edible food they were throwing into the bin, they reconfigured their shopping habits and cooking habits. So intervention does work, but it's that, again, go back to those adoption curves. It's really hard to get on people's radars these days. Everybody's so darn busy and consumed.
So in response, Dan Knapp has said here, perhaps a way to overcome embedded political opposition would be to run teach-ins on how to write and pass citizens' initiatives. Everyone I've been involved with in writing was a series of whereases and ending in therefores. The important thing is that all the whereases, plural, have to be true, and the therefores come naturally as the end product of all the thinking based on the whereases. One of ours stopped an incinerator. Another created a funding agency now called Stop Waste, funded by landfill surcharges. Another person responded, Homegrown Minneapolis recently awarded 16 grants to community organizations to grow more local food and prevent wasted food. Here's a summary of the grants, and it's linked in the chat.
Let me add on that point, and this I learned from our friend Rick Aho in Michigan. The USDA has a number of programs for innovative urban agriculture that is just ideal for community-based composting to work with their city or county to get funding. So that's another source. And if I may, I want to pick up again on Dan Knapp mentioned the teach-ins. I wanted to emphasize the educational component of composting within the family. I know from personal experience and from many, many others, families that in our neighborhoods, that when young people get involved in composting, they just learn so much. Environmental education becomes second nature when you're growing up with composting and you're familiar with the processes and the bugs, all contributing to creating what we call nature. And I will say that my kids and many other kids who have, and grandkids, have carried on composting, vermicomposting experiments. It's just a wonderful way to introduce young people to all kinds of environmental education. And it's very rewarding. The professional psychologists actually say that it reduces nature deficit disorder. Nature deficit disorder apparently is a syndrome of young people growing up without any connection to nature. As I summarize it, young people are growing up thinking that Twinkies grow on trees. And of course, composting, the composting process teaches the natural process of what happens in nature. And this is just a wonderful part of young people's education, and it stays with them throughout their lives and extended to the next generation. Chris, did you have other questions from the chat?
I did have some other questions, but unfortunately we have a hard stop at 2:30.
Oh,
so
okay.
I think it would be great if we could end now.
Okay.
And thank you so much to our speakers, Nora and Craig. for being such amazing fonts of wisdom here. I'm learning a lot, and I'm probably going to have to go through this video several times. The video will be available for others to see once it's finished being set up, and we will also attach the chat, save the chat to that as well.
Very helpful, Chris. Thank you for that. And I also want to point out that Rick, Chris, and I are already planning our next webinar. It will be toward the end of the year in December. Everyone here will certainly get notices. And we're going to focus on compost programs that are involved with farmers, both urban farmers and traditional farmers are more and more being brought into the compost industry. And this is a welcome addition. It's a very significant part of the infrastructure for composting throughout the country. And having said that, I again want to echo what Chris just said. Nora and Craig, thank you so much for your time, and also for the time you put into organizing the presentation. I am sure that the video is going to become a classic in the field of composting. So thank you again. And thank you everyone else for participating and adding your questions.
Yeah, and
to seeing you in a couple of months.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Chris and Rick and Neil, for the opportunity. We obviously love the topic, or we still wouldn't be at it. We still think there's a lot to get done, and look forward to doing it all with everyone. And I just appreciate everybody being here. And thank you.
I would like it if Neil, Rick, Nora, and Craig could stay. Gary, if you'd like to stay as well. Everybody else, thank you so much for attending. It's been such an honor to see all these great names paying attention to what Nora and Craig have to say. Thank you for participating.